I'll be reading some scripture today. Colossians 3:12 through 15. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you are called to peace, and be thankful.
Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to come together today for this conference on faith and science. Thank you for giving us purpose and for choosing us and calling us to be your people. Please continue to guide the remainder of the discussions throughout this conference, and let your name be glorified through each one of them. Please bless everyone involved in this conference, the speakers, the organizers, and the participants, with your abundant wisdom to engage in fruitful conversations which please you and advance your kingdom in our hearts and in our campuses and in our countries. God, I pray that you will give us grace to be kind and patient, gentle, and humble to those around us as you are with us. God, I pray that you will let your light and life-giving love be poured out through us to reach campuses and communities all around the world for you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. One bit of the disclaimer that I also need to add is that we have these wonderful sponsors, but that the views expressed by the speakers are not necessarily those of the John Templeton Foundation, the Arizona Center for Christian Studies, or other sponsors. But that's the point. We all don't agree. In fact, I find myself not agreeing with myself quite frequently. But how we disagree is critical. And that's why we're emphasizing these virtues of humility, wisdom. I was at a conference, the Alpha Conference, and their tagline, which is so meaningful, was love listens. Love listens. We're called to listen first. I think James said, be slow to speak and quick to listen. So with that, there will be things said today that you will probably disagree with, but may I encourage you to consider the virtues that we were just read so beautifully from Colossians. That sums up so much in such a short verse. If we lived like that, I think the world would be much more interested in what Christians have to say if we led with love. Enough said. Not enough said, actually. We're going to say it all day long. But now let's go to the video. I just want to quickly introduce this video. Father Michael Ward is a researcher. He's on faculty of religion and theology at the University of Oxford. He's actually saying Mass right now, so he could not join us virtually. But he was gracious enough to do a pre-recorded Zoom call with us, and Father Daniel Cruz, who's Assistant Director of the Newman Center here at ASU. So we'll show 15 minutes of it. It was a full 45-minute video, which will be posted when we post the rest of our videos in full. But it's the copy of Michael Ward, here's a copy of Abolition of Man, but Michael Ward's book, I guess, disappeared. So all I can say is the same cover, only much thicker. You can see this is a relatively thin book. Michael wrote a very thick book about a thin book. And that tells you there's a lot going on in this book that needs to be explained and unpacked. So he will kind of start us off with this 15-minute video. I highly recommend it. Michael Ward's book is called After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. Highly recommend it. It's published by Word on Fire Academic. And so I want to give them a plug. Please get a copy of both. And they actually have a special where you can get both copies together. I think it's for $25. Well worth the investment. Best $25 you'll spend, except for some of the other books we have.
Father Ward, thank you for being here. And so as a millennial, this is a great rediscovery for our, just for our very time in this place. And so I want to know what prompted you or inspired you to even create this lengthy commentary on C.S. Lewis's book, and what details would you like to share with us to to help us understand and why this guide and commentary?
Well, what inspired me, what prompted me to write this guide was initially an invitation to produce a foreword, a preface to a new edition of The Abolition of Man. And as I was writing this preface, it grew and it grew and it grew, and until I thought, golly, this is looking a bit more like a standalone book than just a preface. And by a long, convoluted set of circumstances, the preface was never published. And I changed publisher, and Word on Fire Academic eventually brought out this After Humanity, which is this guide to Lewis's book. So that's how it came about. The immediate presenting cause, but a more substantial reason that I decided to take it on, the reason I thought it was worthwhile, was because, C.S. Lewis himself regarded The Abolition of Man as perhaps his favorite among his books. And it's very widely admired among a great range of thinkers, and not all of them by any means Christians or religious believers. Many atheists and skeptics and agnostics regard this book very highly too, which indicates that Lewis is probably doing something right, or at any rate, something very interesting. And then more personally, I found it very helpful, but also a challenging book. It's quite a difficult work by C.S. Lewis's standards. He's normally extremely accessible, but here he's operating at a much higher intellectual level than in many of his works. The Abolition of Man originated as 3 high-level philosophical lectures at the University of Durham, and unless you're given some sort of mode of entry into the Abolition of Man, it can seem a little bit abstruse and esoteric. So that's another reason for my guide. In my years of teaching C.S. Lewis, I've noticed that my students often find it difficult. I find it difficult myself. I'm no philosopher. So I wrote this book partly to assist my own understanding. And I found, as I delved into the Abolition of Man more and more, that it became a much more interesting work and much more connected to the rest of Lewis's thought too. And I think that may be one of the reasons why he regarded it as almost his favorite among his books, because you might almost say that it states the theme of his key interests as a thinker, and that all his other works are just the variations on this theme. So those are some of the reasons that led me to write this book.
I'm grateful for that too, because I was reading The Abolition of Man, and I think I got it. Well, for the most part, but then, oh no, there's a lot more to that. And especially the context, the historical context, the time it was written, where Lewis was seeing things going. And so I would say now let's kind of dive into that first part of that book, if that's okay, entering into the first part of this book is titled Men Without Chests. And in this first part, he throws out there of the importance of objective value and also having that subjectivism. So you want to kind of dive into that and kind of give us some highlights and show what that importance of that argument for objective value is in that first essay.
Yeah. Well, as you say, the first chapter is called Men Without Chests, and this relates to a model of the human person that Lewis develops, a model of the human person philosophically considered in 3 parts: the head, the chest, and the belly. And in the head, we are rational, we are spiritual. In the belly, we are sensual, we are visceral. But in the chest, we can, if we are properly formed as human beings, we can connect our rational selves and our visceral selves and thereby become truly human. A classic definition of the human person is the rational animal. And the chest is the indispensable liaison officer between our ability to reason and our ability to feel, between our logical selves and our appetitive selves. So the chest is that which enables us to be both emotionally intelligent and intelligently emotional. the chest is like a pressure chamber, that enables you to connect, to admit sensations and feelings into one's rational life without them swamping, without them overwhelming your capacity to reason. But it's also works the other way. It's that which enables the reason to control and guide the feelings without squelching them, without just eradicating them. Because there's always a tendency for the chest to become weak, men without chests. And if we have an insufficiently developed chest, this seat of magnanimity, the seat of humanity, then we either evaporate upwards into a kind of false spirituality, when we forget that we are actually embodied creatures, and our embodiedness is an important part of our nature, or else we just devolve downwards into raw animality, and leave behind us our capacity to act rationally. So the chest is definitively the human faculty, the humanizing faculty. Unite the angel in our spiritual selves with the animal in our appetitive selves, and you have the anthropological. The human being is a union of the human brain and the human belly in the human breast. That's a good way of summarizing Lewis's model of the human person in this opening chapter. So the idea is that we need to have feelings as part of our human selves, but feelings which are stabilized, which are regularized, which are civilized. Feelings are not irrelevant to the rational life. And that's partly why the subtitle of the book has to do with education. Mm-hmm. The Abolition of Man is subtitled Reflections on Education, with special reference to the teaching of English in the upper forms of schools. Because part of Lewis's whole thesis is that in order to develop the chest, we need to be formed with this emotional intelligence. And that happens largely through education in schools, but also even more importantly, in the home, in the way that we are brought up by our parents. And unless the chest is developed from a very early age, this integration between our thoughts and our feelings won't ever satisfactorily bind. The connection won't be successfully made unless it happens early in life. Give me a boy until he's 7 and I will show you the man, the old Jesuit maxim, you remember that? And that's why early years education is so absolutely crucial in laying down this fundamental principle that we are rational, but we are also sensual, and we need to combine the two in harmonious and integrated ways.
And so as the intellectual schools and thoughts that he's bringing up, there's an introduction too of deviating from that objective value. Can you speak on a little bit more of like what he's countering there? Or
yeah, well, we haven't really yet explained what all this talk about chests has to do with objective value, but that is the fundamental target of Lewis's opening chapter. And the best way to get into it is simply to summarize his own introduction, where he talks about a school textbook, hence the Reflections on Education, a school textbook, which is supposedly about English composition, but the authors of this textbook, Lewis calls them Gaius and Titius to save their blushes. The authors of this textbook talk about the famous occasion when the poet Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, was looking at a waterfall in the Lake District here in England, and a fellow tourist wanted to describe this waterfall as pretty, but Coleridge thought that was incorrect and that a better adjective would be sublime. Now, the authors of this textbook say, in commenting on this exchange between Coleridge and this other tourist, that neither speaker was really saying anything about the waterfall in itself. They were just saying how the waterfall made them feel. And Lewis says, well, this is plainly untrue, because if there was nothing objective in the waterfall, what would be the point of talking about it at all? If you found it pretty and I found it sublime, so what? That would be the end of discussion. There's no point in even debating that whether one adjective is more accurate than another if there's nothing intrinsic to the waterfall that we can argue about. If it's merely a projection from our own subjective feelings, then all human discourse is effectively nullified. There's no point to talking, is there? That we're just trapped in our own solipsistic selves. We can't seriously, meaningfully communicate with other human beings because there's nothing out there to communicate about. And he points out how the authors of this textbook, Gaius and Titius, don't really believe that this subjectivist philosophy that they seem to be propounding. They can't, because if they thought that value was purely subjective, why would they bother to write a textbook about it? They don't want us, as we read their textbook, to say, oh, how nice you feel that value is subjective. They want us to acknowledge that they've said something true, something objectively true. So Gaius and Titius, Lewis says, are better than their principles, but they're deeply inconsistent in their philosophy. Mm. So that's the way that Lewis uses Gaius and Titius's book. He calls it the Green Book as a springboard into his argument about the objectivity of value. And that I hope shows how he connects objectivity with the chest, because it's the chest which trains our emotions to be more, or it may be less, suitable, more related to the objective realities that we encounter as we go through life.
Anything else you'd like to add to kind of close in into this first lecture from C.S. Lewis, or anything to?
Well, yes, this tradition of belief in objective value is a very, very long-standing tradition indeed in the history of philosophy. It goes back all the way to Plato and Aristotle. Lewis repeatedly quotes Plato and Aristotle and other ancient thinkers like St. Augustine. It has a long, long lineage through Pascal, Dostoevsky, and any number of more recent thinkers. What Lewis is targeting, the school of thought which he's attacking, is a relatively recent development in the history of philosophy, and it's principally connected with logical positivism, which was very rampant in Lewis's day in the first half of the 20th century, and it was logical positivism and associated schools of thought which held that that objective value was really just a mirage. It was a chimera, and that the only things that were worth talking about were things that could be scientifically discussed, scientifically measured and falsified and or verified. Everything was, the scientific mode of knowledge became the only acceptable mode of knowledge to a logical positivist. And that's Lewis's principal target as he writes The Abolition of Man.
The second lecture called The Way, he has the Tao in the second part of the book. And so can you help relate this to virtue on our conference of Enriching Life with Science, Faith, and Virtue, and how we could learn from the Tao and keep that consistent, which has been, historically there throughout our history and even till today.
Yeah, well, the second chapter is called The Way. Elsewhere in the book, Lewis talks about the Tao, using the Chinese term as a deliberate way of trying to disconnect his argument from automatic assumptions that he's just going to be talking about Christianity.
Hmm.
The abolition of man is not a Christian argument, as it happens. I mean, it's obviously entirely compatible with Christianity, but it's not a religious argument per se. Lewis points out in the course of the book that although he is himself a theist and indeed a Christian, he's not attempting here any even indirect argument for theism. So a supernatural origin for the Tao, namely objective value, is not something he's going to get into in this book. And this is one of the reasons why the abolition of man has appealed so much to atheists and agnostics.
Right.
It doesn't require its readers to be signed up members of particular religious confessions. But the Tao, the way, is this traditional scheme or reservoir of objective value, which all human traditions, all human cultures and societies down through the ages and across the world have essentially recognized to one degree or another. And that's why at the end of The Abolition of Man, Lewis has an appendix in which he cites 8 moral rules and gives quotations from any number of different cultures that support these 8 principles or rules, such as duty to one's elders and ancestors, or duty to one's children and to posterity, the duty of special beneficence, the duty of general beneficence, the duty of honesty and fair dealing, and so forth. And by drawing upon any number of societies and cultures around the world, Native American, ancient Egyptian, Babylonian, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, any number of others, he shows how different cultures have all recognized very largely the same set of moral objective truths. This is one of the ways in which he argues it can be believed. This is not a logical proof that it must be so, but it's a great testimony. All these concurrent opinions converging on a similar point show there must be something to it. So that is the way, the Tao. And as we are formed in our upbringing and in our education, we can be brought up into this way of being human. It's like an ethical ecology. It's like a moral atmosphere that you just breathe in. You breathe it in with your mother's milk almost. It's not something that we have invented as human beings. It's rather something we have discovered. And it's impossible, Lewis says, to imagine a culture in which a person was admired, say, for throwing down his arms in battle and deserting his country, or in which a person was admired for continually lying or stealing. So if we are well brought up, we are trained up into this way of being human, and we learn to live within it. But we can't step outside it. This is Lewis's principal point. It's because it's not something that we own. It's something that we discover. It's rather like the rules of mathematics. We haven't discovered them. We haven't invented them. We've discovered them. And if we try to step outside the Tao, we're stepping into the void. We're ceasing to be human, because there is no other way of being human. We either evaporate up into full spirituality, as I mentioned, we become angelic or very possibly demonic, or we degenerate downwards into mere animality. But there is no way of being human except through this incorporation of our feelings and our thoughts and our habits of life into this objectively moral code or scheme or framework, however you want to call it. Now, how does this relate to enriching life with science and faith and virtue? Well, first of all, it must be remembered that virtue itself is interesting etymologically, because the vir in virtue comes from the same root as virile or virility, the manly. The virtuous person is the truly human person who knows how to be human as opposed to angelic or animal. That's why virtue is so central to the moral life. It's definitive of our humanity. What's that got to do particularly with science? Well, as Lewis points out, in defending objective value, he is defending, amongst other things, the value of knowledge, and science itself just means knowledge. So if there is no such thing as objective value, there can be no such thing as science. That's a simple logical point that he makes, that if there's no such thing as if value is purely subjective, then scientific inquiry is purely subjective too, and then scientists can't claim that what they're discovering is true. So that's one very basic point. Another is that scientists themselves, like all human beings, need to be virtuous. Here I'm quoting Lewis, he says, if my duty to my parents is a superstition, then so is my duty to posterity. If justice is a superstition, then so is my duty to my country or my race. If the pursuit of scientific knowledge is a real value, then so is conjugal fidelity. Now, that's an interesting pairing. The Tao is a seamless garment, as it were. Objective value runs the gamut across from the most impersonal scientific inquiry through to the most personal relationship imaginable, namely marriage. And so if you want to be an honest scientist in the laboratory, it would help you to be an honest husband or wife, because lying in one area of your life may well bleed into lying in other areas. And scientists, if they are to be reliable and respectable, need to be honest people. So science itself can be pursued virtuously or not, as the case may be. Scientists, in terms of their honesty, need to work without thinking that their findings are going to come to preset conclusions. Scientists need to, for instance, be open about who's funding their research. Scientists, for instance, they need to be courageous about presenting their findings to, say, political authorities who might find it inconvenient. Experiments need to be conducted virtuously, ethically. So science is necessarily going to be virtuous and indeed founded on the belief in objective value, if it is going to continue to be the highly valuable thing that it is. As Lewis says, nothing that he's saying in The Abolition of Man should be taken as an attack upon science. All he's doing is raising questions about the limits of scientific inquiry. And that's something that we can perhaps get into.
I didn't detect any anti-science in that, but I'm sure the critics and others might receive that in that way. And so as he's receiving, giving us this this final part of the book of the warning signs that this is the progression if we deviate, from all, of who we are as humans and man and with the way and the Tao. So the consequences of that they're going to have consequences of that. And so do you want to speak it to the what you perhaps see now or how this is being prophetic, and especially, almost 80 years later, what can you say about now into the third part of the book?
In the third part of the book, which is entitled The Abolition of Man, like the book itself. So the third chapter sums up where Lewis is going with this argument. And he's saying that if we turn our backs on the objectivity of value, we are going to effectively eradicate ourselves as human beings. We'll bring about our own abolition, including the abolition of science.
Mm-hmm.
Science needs to be grounded in a belief in the objectivity of value. He points out how there's always a temptation for human beings, not just scientists, but for all of us, to confuse our ability to do something with the value of doing something. In other words, to confuse might with right, to think that power is the only value. But as he points out repeatedly in the course of his argument, If we take that step, then we are outside the realm of objective value altogether, because we have reduced value to a simple exercise of will. This I will, so I command. He quotes the Roman writer Juvenal to that effect. But if reason is indistinguishable from our will, then we are lost. The isolated principle of will, as the philosopher Iris Murdoch puts it, is no ground for moral behavior at all. In the course of my research into the abolition of man, I came across a very helpful observation from Gilbert Mylander about the abolition of man. And let me just quote it, because I think it helps sum this up rather neatly. Gilbert Mylander says this: there may be a tendency to claim that this older view, this belief in objective value, which Lewis espouses, cannot be genuinely rational. Hence, attempts to alter the basic character of birth and breeding, he's talking here about eugenics, for instance, are seen as the product of rational investigation, while a claim that there may be knowledge of this sort which we do not want, though such a claim may strike some chord deep within us, will seem to many an attack on reason. But Lewis contends that if man is nothing more than his freedom to reshape himself, if his nature is merely to be an isolated principle of will, Iris Murdoch, then there can be no reason to shape himself after one pattern rather than another. The view we think rational turns out, Lewis suggests, to be precisely the opposite. Because what's advantageous about some eugenic modification about a person, unless we have reason to think that a human person is better off in this shape rather than that shape. But if the only principle that is guiding our decision-making is simple willpower, then we have no such access to value judgments. We've left the realm of value altogether. So that's why might cannot be right. That's why power in and of itself is not sufficient to guide us as moral beings.
Do you see that now taking place? Are there any, legitimate insights that are taking place that are relevant to science, especially now, almost 80 years later? And do you see any of that going, the practice now that we should perhaps be aware of, or
Well, again, this is not peculiar to science. This desire to resort to mere power claims is not simply a scientific temptation, though of course it has been very memorably depicted in connection with science. You think of the Frankenstein myth, the mad scientist in his lab who creates a monster which turns against him and destroys him. That from the early Romantic period onwards has really troubled the modern imagination. So from Mary Shelley and her Frankenstein onwards, all the way up to Jurassic Park. Think of Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, but they didn't stop to think if they should. So the mere fact that we can do something, either in science or in art or in any department of life,
exactly,
it's not going to be a sufficient guide to whether we should do it or not. We need to retain our foothold in the Tao, in this way of being human, if we are to have any grounds for preferring one mode of behavior or conduct or inquiry or experimentation over another.
Father Ward, one last thing. The abolition of man, what does that mean?
Well, unless we stay within the Tao, as I've mentioned, we are likely to become either falsely spiritual or improperly sensual. That's one way in which our humanity will be abolished. But more precisely, Lewis argues that in stepping outside the Tao, in trying to, as it were, assert our own value system, which turns out to be merely just an exercise of power, where will we end up? Because our will, our decision to prefer one thing over another in any given choice, as I've just explained, can no longer be morally reasonable. It will just be whatever we happen to want in the moment. What I want, so I command, as Juvenal puts it. And what we want will be determined by random association of ideas, the weather, our indigestion, our genetic inheritance. Any number of sub-rational motives will take the place of traditional morality. So in the very process of asserting ourselves over nature, we turn out to have surrendered to nature. That is to say, the irrational or the sub-rational motives which course through all these natural processes. That's the fundamental way in which we will have, cut off the bough on which we're sitting. We will have slit our own throats. In the very process of advancing into greater glory, we will have actually destroyed ourselves altogether. And Lewis points out how there is this fatal linear progression that dominates the modern imagination. We're so used to dealing with numbers, he says, that we think that every step that we take along a given path must be the same as every preceding step. But Lewis points out how there is a final step which is incommensurable with all preceding steps. And he jokingly points out, he refers to the famous Irishman who discovered that he could heat his house with a certain kind of stove, and the fuel costs would drop by half. And he concluded that if he bought 2 such stoves, he could heat his house with no fuel at all. And that kind of illogical progression is precisely what Lewis is trying to put his finger on in this assertion of power as the fundamental basis of rationality. No is Lewis's point. That is to step outside rationality altogether, into the pure Nietzschean voluntarism, the dictatorship of relativism, as Benedict XVI called it. It looks very tempting, but it's absolutely fatal. And it's interesting to step outside of Lewis's non-fiction for a moment and to turn to his fiction. If we look at one of his Narnia Chronicles, The Magician's Nephew, we have depicted in that story the witch, Jadis, who is the queen of charm. And she, at one point in the story, she utters a deplorable word, which brings death to every living thing in her kingdom, including herself. That's a prime example of what Lewis is talking about. And interestingly, in that story, he sort of glances towards nuclear annihilation, that we've now got the power to destroy ourselves, but should we, just because we can? Well, obviously not. That would be a genocidal suicide. We could do it. We certainly shouldn't. That's the prime example of showing that power, that might is not the same as right. But interestingly, it's not just the wicked witch who does this in the story, because earlier on, we've seen Diggory, the young boy, do a very similar thing in principle when he strikes the bell, which wakes the queen, which wakes this witch. And he strikes this little bell with a hammer. And he does so because he can't resist the wording at the foot of this bell, which goes like this: "Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger, or wonder till it drives you mad what would have followed if you had." And Diggory his curiosity is so inflamed by this. What will happen if I strike the bell? That he forces himself upon Polly. It's a little sort of moment of violence and intimidation that Diggory is using his greater strength against Polly to get to this bell. And Lewis is depicting that as done in a very small, little, recognizable way, what is done ultimately by the witch in when she utters the deplorable word. So there are any number of steps in which this moral failure can can be evidenced. It's not just Frankenstein. We all do it in our own ways at our own level.
Is it even possible to develop a new natural philosophy or a regenerate science, as Lewis called for by Lewis?
Yes, Lewis in this third chapter of the book does ask himself, is it possible to imagine a new natural philosophy, a new way of thinking scientifically, which is immune to this temptation of the lust for power? And one option that he ventures to suggest is this. He says that we should be continually conscious that the natural object produced by analysis and abstraction, as we stand over against nature, that abstract analysis is only a view. It's not the reality as such. And we should always be attempting to correct that abstraction. He says that the regenerate science, which I have in mind, would not do even to minerals and vegetables what modern science threatens to do to man himself. When it explained, it would not explain away. When it spoke of the parts, it would remember the whole. While studying the it would not lose what Martin Buber calls the thou situation, the relationship that we have with nature. We can't just treat nature as raw material, including ourselves, and expect ourselves to be anything but raw material. If we treat the natural world as just so much raw material to be chopped up and to suit our own desires, whatever those desires happen to be at any given moment, then we can't complain when nature takes its vengeance upon us. Fracking and genetic modification of crops and environmental despoliation and all these things which have come to pass in the decades since Lewis wrote his book prove the relevance, the importance of his case with ever greater intensity with every passing year.
The last word. You got it, Father Ward.
Well, one interesting thing that I find particularly intriguing in The Abolition of Man is what Lewis says about stars, because a lot of my work has been analyzing Lewis's treatment of medieval cosmology and how he uses that imaginatively in the Narnia books. And in The Abolition of Man, he says that the stars lost their divinity as astronomy developed. We no longer think of the stars and the planets as gods and goddesses influencing us on Earth. And he says, well, that's a natural and proper development. However, it's not the whole story. He goes on to say it's not the greatest of modern scientists who feel most sure that the object, the stars, stripped of their qualitative properties and reduced to mere quantity, is wholly real. Little scientists and little unscientific followers of science may think so, but the great minds know very well that the object so treated is an artificial abstraction, that something of its reality has been lost. In other words, what Lewis is tackling here is reductionistic, naturalistic materialism. The idea that when we've quantified something, when we've measured it, when we've said of the stars, what are they made of? Where are they in the sky? How quickly do they move? How old are they? When we've answered all those questions, have we said everything that there is to be said about the stars? Well, no, because there are many other questions that could be asked about not just what are they and then how do they move, but why are they? For whom were they made? Who made them, if anybody? Those questions of personhood, those questions of quality as opposed to quantity, are the larger questions that science, in principle, is not interested in, and that's proper. That's right and proper, because science needs to have boundaries to its department of inquiry. But those larger questions, the why questions, the who questions, are questions of the arts and the humanities, and indeed of religion. But there should be no, foreclosing of those questions as if they don't merit to be asked just because they don't fall within the realm of science. I mean, how arrogant would that be? And great scientists are not arrogant like that. They know that something of the reality escapes the scientific net. those scientific questions can't, in principle, answer some of what we want to know about reality. So I think that's one of the basic points underlying Lewis's approach to science. He's just acknowledging that it's only one department in human knowledge, and there aren't many other ways in which we come to know the world.
Again, thank you so much, Father Ward, for your time here. This has been a wonderful and insightful time, and I thank you greatly for just reintroducing to another generation, once again, the Abolition of Man and your excellent guide. I am eternally grateful for that, and I hope many are inspired today to read the Abolition of Man and the guide, because they both go excellently together, and I thank you for that.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We're set to go. We're set to go. We're set to go. We're set to go.